They say they're my bank. They've confirmed my postcode and my account number. They say they've spotted suspicious activity on my account. They could be my bank. Now they've asked me to move my money to a safe account they've set up. That tells me they are not my bank. My money? My info? I don't think so.
A genuine bank will never contact you asking you to move your money to a safe account. Take 5.
Would you welcome Peter Hitchens and Howard Marks? Thank you all very much for coming for this special session on the war on drugs. We're going to have 2 contributions from our 2 guest speakers, and then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, as quickly as we can, because we want to have as many questions and comments as is possible that we can take in this evening. I'm sure you all know our 2 speakers, but just briefly, Peter Hitchens is a columnist on the Mail on Sunday, writer of many books, debunker of many myths, and fantastic writer, a challenging writer. Howard Marks is equally as challenging. He's got a history of, he was imprisoned for when he was caught by the DEA in the United States, and his books include Mr. Nice, Senor Nice, and a new series of crime novels, which hopefully we'll maybe touch on a bit as well, if we have the chance to. So as I said, we're going to have 2 10-minute cases made, but first we're going to have a vote, which is, and we'll come back to this at the end, the motion is the possession and use of recreational drugs should be made legal in the UK. Who agrees with that motion, that recreational drugs should be made legal in the UK? My faithful teller in the front will be able to answer. Who disagrees with that motion? And who doesn't know? That's interesting. Okay, I would say about 60% in favour. More? 70% in favour.
I like a challenge.
And about 15% each on the other way. So it does give you, Peter, a real challenge. And we're going to start with Peter Hitchens, who will make his case against. Thank you very much, Peter.
Good evening. I nearly didn't make it here this evening. I woke up this morning feeling so terrible that it eventually came to me that every single member of the staff of The Guardian had been sticking pins into a wax doll of me the previous day. It certainly still feels more or less that way. It'll be The Observer tomorrow and The Independent the day after that. I knew where to sit because I could see Howard's glass of beer there, and it reminded me of an evening long ago at which something rather surprising happened, which I think I should share with you because it is an interesting part of this debate. Howard and I have debated this subject before. We disagree completely and without reservation about what we think. But we believe very strongly that there should be open, full and honest debate about it. And the first time we debated this, somebody from the National Union of Students thought that I had said something tremendously politically incorrect. I mean really politically incorrect. Not just politically incorrect, but tremendously politically incorrect. And he marched up to the platform and he said to me, "Right, you're leaving." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You know why." And I said, "I don't." And then he switched off the microphones. And he said, "You've got to get off the platform." And at that moment, Howard, who was taking part in the same debate, stood up and said, "Well, if he's going, I'm going too." And for that, I honour and respect him as a gentleman and a chivalrous opponent and somebody who believes, as you have to do in this discussion, in complete freedom of speech and in the willingness to listen to what the other side has to say. And so I'm going to ask you all another question on top of the ones you've already been asked, and that is there anybody in this room who's got a completely closed mind on this subject? Fantastic. Right, now you're going to have to prove it. My point, and the whole purpose of my book, is quite simple, which is that we have had in this country now, for 40 years, the effective decriminalisation of most illegal drugs, particularly the effective decriminalisation of cannabis. that those who point to the supposed experiments in Portugal or the Netherlands or anywhere else saying this is where decriminalisation has taken place are pointing their fingers in the wrong direction. If you want to see what happens to an advanced, industrialised, civilised country when it decriminalises drugs, here is where you need to look. The second point of that is this, that an enormous amount of the argument which now rages around this subject is based on the following proposition. The war against drugs has failed. We have tried prohibition since 1971. What you see is the disastrous results of an attempt to use the law to crush drug taking. That has failed. Therefore, the next logical progression is to abandon that war. And the reason why I've taken such particular trouble to examine and explode this claim is because we have now reached a stage where report after report, there's another one due along in a minute from the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee, and there was one 2 weeks ago from yet another of these supposedly independent commissions which Lady Runciman keeps chairing. What else she does, I don't know. And they all say the same thing. They say the war against drugs has failed, and as a result it should be abandoned. And they serve in doing so an enormously powerful lobby, and a very well-financed lobby so far as I can see, which would very much like to see certain drugs, which are now technically illegal, become legal enough for them to go on commercial sale. And of course that would be the revolutionary change in our society from which there could be no return whatsoever. I can't here give you all the details in my book of how false the argument about the war on drugs is. I can make a number of points which I think ought to stick in your memory. First of all, the 1971 Act is one of the most extraordinary pieces of legislation ever to pass through Parliament. This is because it was actually tabled by both Labour and Conservative parties in the space of a year. The Labour Party attempted to put it forward on the basis of the Wootton Report in 1970, and it fell, because a general election was called in June 1970, which some of you will be old enough to remember, I certainly can. And then, almost immediately afterwards, the Conservative government, which had won the election, took over the exact text of the Misuse of Drugs Bill and piloted it through Parliament. So poor old Jim Callaghan, who had very reluctantly had to put it through on behalf of the Labour Party in 1970, was then faced with being formal opposition to it the following year in 1971. It didn't make any difference, it went through anyway. The crucial sections of this Act were as follows. One, they made distinctions between illegal drugs. They distinguished between particularly cannabis and between cocaine, heroin and LSD, the bogeyman drugs, the ones which everybody at least affects to believe are terribly dangerous. They gave it a special status, at that stage Class B, later Class C, but a status on which it could be argued over and over and over again that it was a soft drug. An extremely clever piece of public relations. A soft drug. A soft drink is a harmless drink without alcohol. A soft option is the one you prefer to take. The soft cop is the one you prefer to the hard cop. A soft drug is a phrase which has gone down the decades, making many, many people think that this enormously powerful drug is actually one which can be taken without any serious danger or risk at all. That was achievement number one. Achievement number two, and this is almost as complicated as the theology of transubstantiation and the Roman Catholic theory that the bread and wine on the communion table turn into the flesh and blood of Christ at the moment of consecration. A very mysterious thing happens to drugs in this country. If you grow them, if you transport them, if you sell them, you are an evil, villainous, dreadful, horrendous person upon whom the law will fall in ton weights with heavy sentences, enormous fines, and the distraint of your property. If, on the other hand, you take these drugs by possessing them, you're treated either as a victim who needs to be indulged and treated, or as somebody whose offence really isn't serious at all and who can be let off. Specifically, as long ago as October 1973, Lord Hailsham, that well-known Trotskyist revolutionary, addressed the Magistrates' Association, that well-known coven of anarchists, and said to them, because they didn't seem to have quite got it straight at that stage, that from now on they were not to send anybody else to prison ever for cannabis possession. And by and large, they obeyed. And it was so effective, this piece of advice, that by 1994, John O'Connor, a former head of the Scotland Yard Flying Squad, could write in the Daily Express, which was then a newspaper, that cannabis was at that stage a decriminalised drug. He didn't know the half of it, because shortly after he wrote that, a very clever campaign would be waged to remove the remaining penalties from possession, so that, in the most recent figures available, the principal penalty for somebody found in possession of cannabis by the police, if they can be bothered to do anything about it at all, which is a major question, is something called a cannabis warning, which is not recorded centrally and has no legal force, and does not form any kind of criminal record, and is therefore, in short, being let off. And the most interesting thing about the cannabis warning is it was devised entirely by the police, without any attempt by Parliament to legislate, because a lot of what's been achieved by the decriminalisers in this country in the past 40 years has been done in this way. The law has remained officially upon the statute books, glowering and looking fierce, while the police and the courts and the criminal justice system in general have abandoned any serious attempt to enforce it. That is the position which we are now at, the position which Sir Simon Jenkins, to my great regret, keeps calling a regime of terrible prohibition. It isn't one. Once you recognise that it's not one, you can't really then argue, can you, that there has been a terrible war against drugs which has failed. You can argue, as I argue, that the war against drugs has never even been fought. That's my proposition. There's a lot more to say about it, and I hope we'll say it in debate, but for the moment, I think you'd much rather hear from Howard than me anyway, given what you...
Thank you very much, Peter. Are you going to stand up, Howard? I think you...
Yeah, well,
okay.
If I can.
So, Howard now is going to speak in favour of legalisation of drugs.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me and Peter here, and thanks very much for turning up yourselves. Changing one's state of mind is generally permitted, if not approved and encouraged by the powers that be. Authorities have no problem whatsoever with my getting a high from bungee jumping, diving off a cliff into the depths of the ocean, racing cars, walking tightropes, or fasting for 40 days. They have no problem whatsoever with my getting a buzz from being zapped by a witch doctor, or being mesmerized by a hypnotist. Accordingly, one could be forgiven, I think, for inferring that authority might be equally approving of changing one's state of mind by taking recreational drugs as any other means. And authority was so approving. 100 or so years ago, when Britannia incidentally ruled the waves, anyone could walk into a chemist in Europe and choose from a range of cannabis tinctures, hashish pastes, cocaine lozenges, and opium extracts. He or she could immediately purchase morphine, heroin, and a hypodermic syringe, and could place an order for mescaline. But authority approved the taking of recreational drugs only for several thousand years or so. For almost the last 100 years, authority has not approved. Even though most people take recreational drugs, as they always have, the possession and trade of most recreational drugs have been criminalized under a strategy known as prohibition, known since 1972 as the war on drugs, an absurd phrase coined by the most corrupt United States president ever, Richard Nixon. The war against drugs, now in its 40th year, has failed to reduce supply, failed to reduce demand, increased harm by spreading infectious diseases, caused terminally ill people to die in agony, held back research on new medicines, increased levels of drug-related violence, and brought the law into disrepute by allowing discriminatory policing. Speaking perhaps for the first time with absolute total expertise and authority, it is easy to smuggle drugs into this country. bit more difficult into the United States, but fairly easy into this one. It is easy to grow some recreational drugs in the back garden or wardrobe. People will sell drugs because it's easy. The profits are high and the risks of getting caught are low. This obviously and clearly means prohibition doesn't work, even from the prohibitionist's point of view. Apart from not beginning to achieve its aims, prohibition also makes drugs artificially expensive and spawns an avalanche of acquisitive criminal behavior. The illegal drug business has become so profitable that people have violent fights over territory in which to sell drugs, resulting in 40,000 deaths during the last 4 years in Mexico alone. They can afford to buy guns. Now, guns are bad. Once a country is full of people with guns, the guns will never go away. Across the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa and Latin America, civil war after civil war has been funded by the only strategy available to revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries alike: the mass production of their traditional drugs for sale to the absurdly lucrative global market. Prohibition makes drugs stronger and more dangerous. Prohibition increases any harm that might be caused by recreational drug use. A recreational drug, by virtue of its inherent chemical nature, cannot cause crime. It can only do so through interaction in a social context, which is prohibition and the consequent black market. Prohibition is therefore a root cause of crime, violence, and ill health. Prohibition is not control. It is the abrogation of control leading to unregulated peddling of adulterated substances outside the reach of the law. It would be difficult to construct, even if one deliberately contrived to do so, a policy more physically dangerous, more individually criminalizing, or more socially destructive. Prohibition is an extremely dangerous failure and clearly should be dismantled as soon as possible. Now, Peter maintains that, despite its appallingly dismal record, prohibition, particularly of cannabis for some reason, should not only be maintained but rigorously and consistently enforced by long prison sentences for both consumers and suppliers. They should be treated equally as they are both equally culpable. This is probably the only part of Peter's position with which I agree. Peter further maintains there hasn't been a war on drugs in the UK, just mere lip service resulting from a cunning and manipulative cross-party alliance of stoners and liberal thinkers who produced the Wooten Report in the late 1960s and the consequent Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. Incidentally, this mere lip service has resulted in tens of thousands of people losing their liberty, and at least 16% of the prison population of the UK are there for drug offences. His reasoning rests on the following premises. Drugs are capable of befuddling the brain and producing mental illness. Other premise. It is morally wrong to permit such substances to be legally available. Peter uses words other than befuddling brains, such as smothering thought, rendering inert minds, and particularly likes the word stupefying. Stupefy has two distinct meanings. One, to dull the senses. Two, to amaze or astonish. I and most other drug takers find that drugs tend to enhance sensory perception rather than diminish it, but I do agree that drugs are capable of amazement and astonishment. In support of his first premise, Peter cites the results of several studies purporting to show a correlation between using cannabis and mental health problems. The most recent one being the much publicized Dunedin trials in New Zealand, which claim a correlation between those who began using cannabis in their early teens and those whose IQ dropped in later life. Interestingly, the same study found no such correlation with those who began using cannabis in their late teens. Several studies have been done that show no such correlation. And no study yet that does show correlation has established a direct causal link in any direction. Basically, we have no idea what to conclude. Such paucity of evidential support, however, does not deter Peter from playing safe and implementing his moral stance, which is fundamentally Protestant Christianity, the official religion of the nation, and its principles of shunning self-gratification and unearned reward in this life, and working extremely hard instead to ensure reward will at least be available in eternity. I was brought up by very devout Christian parents. At quite a young age, I was moved and impressed by the parable of the Good Samaritan. Its clear message is, if one loves one's neighbor, one shall have eternal life, regardless of one's religious conviction. Samaritans and Jews despised each other. The message was one of non-discrimination, interracial harmony, and compassion for absolutely everyone. I trust those tenets will be employed in Peter's implementation. At a later stage, when I started smoking and drinking, I found it comforting to know that Christ's first miracle was to turn water into wine, rather than the other way round. And that during the Last Supper, he urged us to drink red wine in remembrance of him. I scoured the Bible looking for evidence that he smoked cannabis. Alas, there was none. But it does state in the Old Testament, second book of Samuel, chapter 22, verse 9, and the 18th Psalm, verse 8, that God smokes. It's not a weird interpretation. The line quite simply is, there went up his smoke out of his nostrils. Peter believes, I missed out these 2 pages because I know I'm talking for too long. Peter believes the 1960s to be the dawn of some type of moral Armageddon. He states, there cannot be much doubt that music based on a loud and relentless drumbeat was designed to excite and arouse not only sexual feelings, but that longing for some sort of action and confrontation that lurks in most men. Music has been based on loud and relentless drum beats for thousands of years. Yet he goes on, the lyrics of many of these songs are also revolutionary. In some cases they contain messages which have sounded to many listeners like advertisements for drug taking. I guess it's not Peter's fault he missed the 1926 hit, I Dreamed About a Reefer 5 Foot Long, or the 1928 hit Cocaine, or, more recently, the 1944 hit, Who Put the Benzodrine in Miss Murphy's Ovaltine? by Harry the Hipster Gibson. Rather dismissively, Peter states authoritatively, all drugs are regulated in some way by law. They aren't. A few examples will, I hope, suffice to make my point. Caffeine, ephedrine, betel nut, Hawaiian baby road rose, San Pedro cactus, various toads that exude pus containing DMT, Salvia divinorum, nitrous oxide, datura, nutmeg, kava, various solvents, assorted herbal highs, and Peter's beloved coffee. Although he talks complete codswallop when it comes to science, in the field of political history, I would never take him on. He knows that subject inside out. I therefore accept that the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 came about much as he's described. But given, as he puts it, the apostles of indulgence were much better at politics than the supporters of self-restraint, one has to accept that the stoners were cleverer than the non-stoners, which at first glance seems to refute his thesis. Far from making people stupid, drug consumption increases both creativity and sensory input. There are receptors in the human brain that react only to cannabis. And as Peter himself stated, we should not reject the great gifts of the senses given us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Howard. Well, who put the Benzedrine in whose Ovaltine?
Miss Murphy.
Miss Murphy's Ovaltine.
I didn't know you were that old. I wasn't.
So, Peter, I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that, but perhaps just draw out a couple of areas. I mean, you talk codswallop, according to Howard. You perhaps come back on that. But what about the science of this? I mean, one of the key areas of your book is you refer to the way that this is affecting the mind. What is the science on it?
Well, I'm very cautious about it because you have to be. The problem is that mental health is a very vaguely defined and subjectively defined thing. It's not like physical illness where there are definite symptoms and where you can discover that someone has lung cancer or emphysema or heart disease as you can when people have been smoking. It's not the same. Even the categories which I shy from using, psychosis and schizophrenia, are themselves very vague. They're mainly defined by the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which I think 30 years ago ruled that homosexuality was a mental illness and has now changed its mind. It's that subjective, that's subject to change. And one has to say, what is mental illness? Is the teacher who observes that somebody who has until recently been the brightest people in her class has now very much ceased to be, is she observing an instance of mental illness? Are the people who are affected in many, many ways by cannabis, which worsen their lives, make them harder to employ, make it harder for them to find work themselves, limit their lives, are they mentally ill in any formal sense that we know? Obviously, in many cases not, and yet there are other occasions, and I make no apology for citing this again because you'll be offered copies of my books and Howard's books outside, but one you should seek out, which I fear may not be there, is one by Patrick Cockburn, the greatest foreign correspondent of modern times, whose son Henry became seriously mentally ill after using cannabis at school. And the account which Patrick has provided of that, and the account Henry has played some part in writing the book, though less than he might perhaps have done if things had turned out differently, should put everybody in mind of wondering just exactly how safe this drug is. It's the trouble, as with so many of these things, is that it's. If you'll hang on a minute, we can have a discussion. But if you'd let me finish the point, it would be easier. The trouble with this is that it's arbitrary. You do not know who it will affect in this way and when. You do know, I think, with some certainty that there is a correlation between the two. And I always cite here, and there's a long chapter in the book about the pathetic excuses advanced by the defenders of cigarette smoking, who were a combination, of course, of the tobacco companies and of people who liked smoking cigarettes, who used very much the same language throughout the 1950s, long after it was clear to any serious person that it was an extremely dangerous thing to do. And as a result, it took us 40 years before we were taking any serious action to save people from that danger. I don't think we want to wait for 40 more years of people becoming dangerously mentally ill and in many cases ruining their life chances. And as a result, of course, this is why cannabis is not a victimless crime, as a result of ruining the lives of everybody who loves them. I don't think we really want to wait that long before we look at this seriously and say, all right, correlation may not be causation, but it also, it isn't necessarily so that correlation is not causation. There could be something very serious here, and it would not be particularly surprising if a powerful mind-altering drug had lasting and damaging effects upon the brain. Now, would it?
Howard?
Well, I don't know how to react to that, really.
Well, try
I will try,
meeting
yes.
it head on.
I will try, yes. I just wonder which bit. I mean, it seems... I mean, you did say that psychiatric science is in its infancy and shouldn't be called an objective study. you've said that there is no objective biochemical test for diseases such as dyslexia. Yes?
That's all absolutely true, yes. I'm very much in favour.
Okay. Well, that's quite simply false, all right?
Method.
A close friend of mine, Professor John Stein, Emeritus Professor of Physiology at Oxford, pioneered the first such tests using magnetic resonance spectroscopy quite a few years ago. His work is prolifically published, highly praised, and widely read. Dyslexia can be determined biochemically.
Can it?
Yes.
Well, it's funny, isn't it, that it never is? However,
it is.
No, it's not. Ask anybody.
Google it right now.
Who's
Just try it.
Whose children are being told.
Just try it.
No.
I don't want sort of a second-hand hearsay, anecdotal rubbish. I mean, these are kind of proper
So what is this test?
studies. What?
So what is this test? If you want to argue about it, what is this test?
It's magnetic resonance spectroscopy. You know what that is?
Okay, so every child that's diagnosed with dyslexia in this country is put through an MRI scan.
I know it hasn't.
It never happened. It
has happened instead.
No, it isn't. It's not. It's not.
Okay, audience, you can find out easily, right? Professor John Stein, dyslexia. Anyone got an iPad?
Well, you could look it up and perhaps ask a question.
The test isn't used. It's not relevant to the point. If you can allegedly diagnose the existence of this thing without this test, then the existence of this alleged test, which I have to say I would have some doubts about, but this isn't the forum to make them, isn't really very relevant to the point, is it? Children are not put through an MRI scanner before they're informed they have dyslexia.
What?
Children are not put through MRI scanners before they're informed they have dyslexia.
You said there was no scientific, objective scientific. Not
if there was, it would be.
If
there was, it would be used.
You think so? They obviously haven't been put through
it. Maybe the thing which your professor friend has diagnosed is not the same as the thing which all these children are told they've got.
What?
Well, if the test isn't applied, Howard, how can you tell? If this test is so good, why isn't it used?
It is used.
No, it isn't used. Nobody is diagnosed with dyslexia using an MRI scan.
They have been.
No, it is not used.
Let's agree to differ on that one.
No, I don't agree to differ. He's talking
This is not a question of opinion. This is a question of fact. You can hold whatever opinion he likes. He knows what I think.
I want to just bring up a question you brought up, which is about how taking drugs enhances creativity.
Yes.
And so on. Do you think that if Peter had taken drugs, he would be a better writer than he is? Or if you hadn't taken drugs, you would be a better writer than you are?
I know that I would be a worse writer. I don't know if Peter would be a better writer.
How can one know? Well, this is a serious question, isn't it, for people who've taken mind-altering drugs. First of all, they haven't reached the ends of their lives, so they don't know what the effect of it is going to be in old age. And secondly, they don't know what they would have been if they hadn't used them. And this boast, it never did me any harm, which I've heard from several arrogant intellectual persons, is not one which can be tested. How do you know? How do you know what you would have been if you had done otherwise? And I can't, again, it's a question that you simply have to ponder. Is it unlikely that the use of a powerful mind-altering drug will in some way damage the brain, an organ of which we know, as it happens, practically nothing?
Sorry, you did say that, you also said that neurology is a science.
Neurology is a science. Do you know any neurologists?
Yeah, there's one called F. Clifford Rose.
Yeah.
He wrote this wonderful book called History of British Neurology, which shows that the science began in ancient Egypt and continued up to the present. It's hardly in its bloody infancy.
Oh, okay. So you want to be operated on by an ancient Egyptian neurologist?
Well, rather than by you, yeah.
Well, I'm not offering to operate.
Neither is the ancient Egyptian.
The only thing I recommend to people is your skincare regime.
You promised to bring me some cream by today, too.
You exchanged gifts earlier on, but you forgot his cream, is that
right? That's right.
Well, it's his cream. I mean, look at the results. Any lady in this audience must see that Howard is an exemplar.
I'm going to open it up to the people in the audience.
I think you better.
Howard, aren't you worried about one of the key points that Peter made, which is that it took 40 years for tobacco
Yes.
to be regarded as
I can take
as
that point up, yeah. I mean, like, Peter's based the thing on the correlation. There was a correlation noticed between tobacco and lung cancer. But not only were they able to establish the causal link, they were able to show that the risk of getting cancer, lung cancer, was directly proportional to the number of cigarettes smoked per day and directly proportional to the number of years to the power of 4. They were able to sort of suggest that hypothesis and test it. With this, there's absolutely no kind of hypothesis yet that's been out there. There's just, well, maybe, it's like just anecdotal. There's nothing.
Well, I don't
We're
know
a long way from there. Why does he want to sort of like put penalties? Why doesn't he settle for the same sort of harm reduction that's been applied to tobacco?
Well, there are two arguments there. One is, of course, that when Richard Dole did his initial research, which was far less elaborate than you've just described, he and all the people who'd been working on that research immediately gave up smoking on the spot. They didn't wait for any further correlation because they were sensible people who could see that they'd uncovered a major danger here, which they couldn't ignore, even if they were wrong.
No,
even if they were wrong.
No, but if you make
even
a
if they were wrong,
even
even if they were wrong, what would they have lost by not paying attention to the correlation? The second thing is, tobacco is already legal, and it is immensely common. Largely, I have to say, due to 2 wartime periods when it's used enormously expanded, particularly among women. But it is legal, and it is therefore far, far harder to drive it back into the corner which, in my view, it ought to be in, that is to say, largely unused. And to recommend that we should make another substance as legal as tobacco, so that we would then have the problem of driving it all the way backwards that we're having with tobacco, seems to me to be completely without logic. Why would you do that? The fact that it is and remains technically illegal is an enormously useful factor if we recognize, as I think we should, that this is a dangerous drug which threatens particularly, but not exclusively, the minds of the young. And if we want to prevent it becoming more widely prevalent, the last thing we should do is get rid of the protections which we have. There's no logic at all in saying we already have 2 dangerous legal poisons in our society. Let's have another one. At least none that I can see, or that could operate outside the locked ward of a mental asylum.
Few points there. I know 2 of the people who worked for Professor Sir Richard Dole. One of them is now Professor of Cancer at London. The other one is Reader in Cancer Studies at Oxford University. Both of them are working for Professor Sir Richard Dole. Neither of them gave up smoking, even when it was well established.
Well,
so the idea that each one of them gave up smoking on the spot simply isn't true.
In his own memoirs, that he and all those working with him did so. I can only, if that's a lie, then there's not much I can do about it. So
okay.
What do you say?
Okay, should we open it up to the audience and get some more questions and comments? I'm going to take one question at a time, and please don't make long speeches because we haven't got huge amounts of time. There is a roving mic as well, so if you could signal to me in advance, I will get the mic to you and then take the mic from you to the next question. So the first one I've got is, I'm going to take the 2 over here, 2 gentlemen over here. You've got the mics yet. So if you could keep your hands up there, and then I will come to the middle section here, you 2, lady at the back and the gentleman there.
Peter, you're saying it because obviously it's illegal, the drugs we're talking about. Okay, and then you say how dangerous they are. But it seems to be in people's nature. It's been going on for years and years, people taking cannabis, and you're saying, well, it's been decriminalised. Point why it's maybe dangerous is people don't know exactly what they're actually taking. So if it was actually legalised, you could see the strength of the actual cannabis, what's actually going on. So over the years, cannabis has got stronger in the last 20 years, since I've been smoking it. You try and find resin, can't find that. You don't know what actually the actual strength of the stuff people are actually smoking. If it was properly regulated, then people would actually know. And also, for something like, say, ecstasy or cocaine, you don't know exactly what it's actually being cut up with. If it was properly regulated, people have better information and know exactly what they're actually taking.
Okay, so it would be safer and for people.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the dangers of prohibition that I mentioned. I mean, there is no sort of like
Hang on a minute, could I possibly respond to that? My argument is not about the level of the dose. My argument is about the drug itself. The drug itself is dangerous, and people shouldn't take it. And the law should not be collaborating with the cynical salesman of dangerous substances, saying this is a safer version of it than others. In fact, again, the cigarette parallel comes up. The tobacco companies back in the 60s and 70s wanted to sell something called a safer cigarette, and the government turned around and said, you absolutely cannot do that. There is no such thing as a safe cigarette, and we will not let you do it. And there's no such thing as safe cannabis either.
But you think there is?
Yes, I mean, I obviously think there is. I mean, there's a specific part of the brain whose function is simply to react as a receptor for cannabis. There isn't a specific part of the brain whose function is to react to tobacco.
Okay. Yes, please.
I just wanted to... I mean, it seems to me that your two stands are... You both agree that the law as it is at the moment is wrong. But Peter Hitchens' point of view seems to be that that to criminalise the activity of the drug taker. It seems to me that the immediate effect of that would be a huge increase in our prison population, largely from people who probably are heroin addicts, who are not going to, if they are helped in a prison environment, that will be incredibly expensive. And are probably just going to get worse. And it would also do nothing to remove the amount of gun crime and gang crime that exists because of these drugs.
Can I explain my proposition? The trouble is, I mean, as I freely admit, the chances of anybody paying any attention to anything that I say are virtually zero. And our criminal justice system is in the hands of people who do not believe in punishing crime and who do not actually believe in maintaining prisons at all. For instance, they maintain them purely for public relations reasons because they know the voters would get very angry if they closed them. But they don't know. It's part of the argument. Our prisons at the moment are warehouses, and to a large extent they're run by the prisoners, and they're full of drugs. No attempt whatever is made, no serious attempt whatever is made to suppress the circulation of drugs in British prisons. So you'd have to change that as well. But my proposition is not to put lots of people in prison. My proposition is based upon law as deterrent. And I would remind again, there will be people in this hall who will remember that in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, it was still very common for people to go out in the evening with their cars and drink quite a lot and then drive home drunk. And this became a very serious problem, and a law was introduced with the breathalyzer attached to it, whereupon it became illegal to drink and drive, and what's more, it became a realistic prospect that if you drank and drove, you would be punished for it. What didn't happen was thousands and thousands and thousands of braying Henrys in the pubs of the home counties demanding that they were sent to jail for the right to drive while drunk. What happened was that because the law was seriously enforced and a few exemplary cases took place and people learned that the police meant what they said and the courts would also take away your license and fine you heavily if you did it, drinking while driving diminished seriously. By contrast, the recent law passed supposedly banning people from driving while using mobile phones, a law which is very dear to me because I ride a bicycle and these are the people who are going to kill me. That law is not enforced. It's simply not enforced. Nobody takes it seriously. If you catch somebody doing it and chase after them, as I do, and remonstrate with them, they will first of all psychoanalyze you, and then they'll laugh and say there's no chance of this law being enforced. They're right. A law which is enforced is enforced in an exemplary, deterrent fashion to stop people from doing things. It doesn't mean you have to fill the prisons with people. I don't honestly believe that faced with the possibility of a prison sentence for being in possession of cannabis, most users would bother using it at all. And the reason why they all hate me so much is they know that. They know that if ever I succeeded in what I did, their lives would be made less convenient for them. And that's why they hate me. I understand that perfectly well, but they wouldn't go to prison for the right to smoke dope. Howard has already been in prison for something much more major than that, but I don't think he would go to prison for the right to smoke dope. He's been there. He knows how unpleasant it is.
I'd go there tomorrow for the right to smoke dope.
Yeah. You would?
Yeah, of course. It's important to me.
For the right
I think
to
the right
smoke
to
dope,
smoke
you'd go to
dope.
prison.
Of course I would.
Well, I think you'd be very lonely.
What? Not if you've got your way. This is going to be full.
I'll come back to you.
I would right to smoke. I would right to you.
Yeah, I'll come to you in a moment. Yeah, I've got you down. Yes, please, the lady with the microphone. Yeah.
I was wondering. This is particularly towards Peter. I was wondering, if you're talking mainly about recreational usage of drugs, I was wondering if you were thinking of instigating a much stronger law enforcement towards recreational use, if you'd also simultaneously change the kind of attitude and law within prescription drugs. I was thinking in particular because as someone who's had problems with pain following like a major operation, I've noticed that sort of in the NHS, opiates and opiate derivatives are very, very widely prescribed. Sort of because it's quite a quick fix, it's much easier than sort of prescribing longer-term therapy, sort of osteopathy or something for pain relief. And despite the fact that these are kind of very sort of inhibiting drugs and they kind of stop you working and you can't function properly, they're very sort of handed out because it's a very easy thing to do. And I was wondering if you were talking about sort of a general attitude towards whether or not people should be on drugs, whether you're also going to kind of extend that into sort of prescription and medicinal usage.
No.
Really?
No. It's of no interest to me. That's not my point.
So you wouldn't think that has like any correspondence in the slightest?
It's nothing to do with my point.
Yes,
my
it is.
My
it completely is, because it's a general attitude towards whether or not like the
permit me to
sort
know
of
what
how
I care
it
about.
affects
I don't care about that.
Does that answer your question, presumably? Yeah? Okay, can we have the microphone back? I've got two on the back row which I want to take while you're up there. If you could keep your hand up, the two of you on the back row, yeah? Take the first gentleman in the blue shirt, I think it is.
So sort of going back to like the inherent use of drugs, like naturally escapism has been around since the dawn of time. So if we look at nutrition, for example, coronary heart disease is now the largest killer globally, okay, and it's caused by escapism via food and diabetes in a lot of cases. Like, if we're fighting a war on drugs, we're fighting against the right to escape, which you're never, ever, ever going to do. There is always going to be that underpinning sort of need in society. So we're fighting against, like, fighting against the removal of prohibition. We're giving that freedom, we're educating people. A lot of the time in lower classes, like where a lot of where this substance misuse really goes on. Okay, if you don't mind me asking, what sort of background did you have when you were growing up? Peter.
Or Peter?
Both of you want to know what their backgrounds were? Well,
yeah.
Howard?
Yeah, my background was a working class mining background in the South Wales valleys.
Peter, what was
brought
yours?
up as a Christian. Took my first drug when I was about 19, other than alcohol, which I took when I was about 14 or so. Tobacco were the same age.
Yeah.
So I suppose, slightly up, bordering on middle class, working class, I would say.
Peter, what was your background like?
Lower upper middle class.
Just a broad spectrum of social class.
I think we ought not to get too deeply into this because
we won't, but that's kind of the point.
Can you pass the microphone just along the row because there's I can't quite see at the back. There was one, wasn't there?
Hi.
And please be brief, please. Yeah.
I just wanted to make the comment that I think the argument for decriminalising heroin particularly is extremely strong, purely on the amount of money that society would save through acquisitive crime not being committed. And I know what I'm talking about because I'm a heroin addict in recovery. I just don't see how you can argue against people being given diamorphine as opposed to going out.
Well, the government agrees with you, because the government have taken on the job of mugging the population from the heroin addict for the methadone program. So every year they mug the taxpayer for hundreds of millions of pounds to give methadone to heroin abusers, and saves them going out and doing it themselves. Fantastic. If you have no moral concerns at all about it, then you should have no complaints about it.
Yeah, but 80% of people that take methadone use heroin on top of it.
Well, the people who are given methadone by the taxpayer then often go and sell it so they can buy heroin. But the program is a farce. But it is, as I say, it takes up hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money, and the money is extracted from you and me on pain of going to prison if we don't pay it. So we can do this thing.
Yes,
that is the extent of the lunacy of British drug policy.
I want to bring Howard in on that, but can you bring the microphone down to the gentleman in the red top who was going to ask a question as well? Howard, do you support methadone programs?
Yes, I do. I mean, but I also support the legalization of heroin. I mean, I think the same argument applies to that. I mean, addiction, which often rears its ugly head at this point, is only a problem if you can't get hold of the stuff. We're all addicted to oxygen. It doesn't seem to cause too much problem.
But heroin possession is legal as far again, the incident of Pete Doherty, who was actually in a court building some months ago when a large amount of heroin fell from his pockets onto the floor, which was observed by a security officer. What happened to him? He walked free from the courthouse. There is no law against heroin possession. It's not enforced.
It's the gentleman in the red jumper, yeah? There's a microphone coming.
No, just one back talking to the microphone so I could hear them better.
Oh, you want to talk in the... Sorry, Howard, yeah.
Sorry.
Is that okay? Yeah, okay. There's a lady at the front who I wanted to bring in next. Sorry, can you bring it down to... I'm trying to get people in order when I can. Yeah, so it's the lady... Can you put your hand up again? Yeah, that's the one, yeah.
I just have one very quick one.
Just have a quick one then, go on.
Are there... this is to Howard. Are there no drugs that you would consider worthy of prohibition?
Not any drugs so far discovered that I can think of. No, I mean, obviously if one discovers or synthesizes a drug that makes you want to go out and kill people and rape them, then obviously it should be prohibited, even if it's natural. But I haven't come across such a drug yet. So I would... Hey, hold on. But I would legalize all recreational drugs so far discovered.
That toad pus drug you mentioned sounded pretty nasty. That drug made from toad pus that you mentioned sounded pretty nasty. You wouldn't ban that one?
It's legal. A toad is legal.
I know, exactly. It was good reason to ban it. Yeah. Never mind.
It was a question for Peter, really. My problem is not that, lots of dangerous things are enjoyable. So I don't have a problem particularly with recreational drugs, except I want to ask you about the arbitrary and sort of illogical nature of the drugs laws, really. And at the moment, we're sort of engaged in a situation where drugs that are currently legal are simple chemical modifications of drugs that are illegal, and it's a constant cat and mouse between, chemists on the one hand who are manufacturing things and the law and the police on the other to make things illegal which are currently not. And it just makes a nonsense of the whole thing. And unless one is going to argue that anything which is psychoactive should be illegal, then why not just recognise that, some things do have a pleasurable effect on the mind, and regulate and control their production and their sale?
Well, there's two simple answers to that. One is that the pleasurable effect on the mind might be followed by a disastrous effect on the mental health. The second is that, of course, it's impossible to chase around new so-called legal highs every week, passing a new law. In a parliamentary democracy, you would never keep up. The real aim of the drug laws is to deter people in general from taking drugs which will damage them, and to create a culture in which doing so is largely frowned upon, and in which particularly the peer pressure upon the young to do is reduced. My main purpose in wanting a serious law against cannabis possession is to provide a counter to the peer pressure which is placed upon school children to smoke this drug, which is enormous and which very few can escape unless they have very strong characters. If they were all able to turn around to those putting pressure on them and say, look, actually, I don't want to have a criminal record, I don't want to be banned for the rest of my life from travelling to several countries I might wish to go to, actually it's stupid for me to smoke this drug, then they could easily get away with it. Any parent who's trying to arm children against dangers of this kind does try to arm them with arguments of that kind. At the moment, nobody in school can argue seriously that cannabis is a drug for which there is any major danger of prosecution. So it doesn't work. I'm not a utopian. Things will get through the cracks. Ultimately, the criminal justice system is street theatre designed to try and protect people from some of the horrible harms which stalk our streets. And it never fully succeeds, but it can do a lot more good than it does now. So no, of course these things are very difficult. And in a state of laws, where laws have to be passed after proper deliberation, you can't pass laws instantly against everything that comes up. There's one other point I would like to make about this, if I may. The question of alcohol, I actually think that the way in which alcohol is now drunk in this country, particularly by the young, with the intention of becoming drunk, which is new to me on the scale that it exists now, is a side effect of the presence in our society of so many drugs. That alcohol is used very much as the illegal drugs are being used. I would do many, many serious things to limit the sale of alcohol as well if I had the power to do so. And it's a very strong part of my argument.
Does that not mean that actually our attention should be more focused on why people indulge in behaviour which is positively damaging to their health, be it things that are currently legal, rather than particularly focusing on a particular illegal drug? Because there's so much, whether it's eating, alcohol, cigarettes, whatever it is, there's plenty of other stuff that we should worry about more.
Well, I'm interested in finding out why I've been in wait a minute, no. Sure, find out why as much as you like. I mean, I have my own beliefs and you may have yours. But here is the point. In a free society, people do what they want to do under the law. And we don't examine their minds or try and change their characters or alter them inwardly. That's what the totalitarians do. What we say to you is, you're free to do these things. If they're legal, you're completely free to do them. If they're illegal, you're free to do them and take the risks which follow breaking the law of punishment that results from that. I'm not really very keen on examining the minds and motives of individuals. It seems to me to be a fundamentally totalitarian approach to people. They should be free to choose. You want to break the law, accept the consequences. That's how free societies operate.
Do you want to come back on that one, Howard? Or should we
No.
No? Okay. Yes, please, yeah.
Yeah, my question's for Peter as well. You seem to take the position that we haven't really had a proper prohibition on drugs, that it's been very half-hearted. So I wondered if you could give some examples of prohibitions that have worked and what the results have been.
It's difficult. I mean, you would, if you looked at either Japan or Sweden, Japan for the entire post-war period, and Sweden not all the time, but since they realized after an experiment with liberalization in the 1960s that it was doing great harm, you will find countries where the approach to drugs is very different from here. You'll also find that in Japan, where the approach is punitive, the use of drugs is very much lower as well. But, of course, these are not societies like ours. They're very different in many fundamental ways. My argument is really about what we could do here. And also, the use of the word prohibition is propaganda. What people do when they introduce the word prohibition as the argument is they immediately conjure up the picture of Eliot Ness and the Untouchables smashing open barrels of beer with axes in Chicago cellars. Actually, I believe that apart from anything else, the prohibition laws in the United States very strongly resembled, in their practical application, the cannabis laws of this country for the past 40 years, in that there was no penalty for possession. The penalties were only for transport, manufacture and sale, but not for possession. And also in that I believe there were only about 250 federal officers charged with enforcing the law throughout the entire United States, which again is pretty much like the feeble effort we make to enforce ours. So the use of the word prohibition is both wicked propaganda to slant the argument, and often advanced by people who don't actually understand what alcohol prohibition was like in the United States, i.e. very ineffective, not particularly sincerely pursued, and indeed lacking any punishment for possession. And how you can expect to interdict a substance by interdicting supply only without interdicting demand, I have absolutely no idea.
Which word would you prefer to prohibition?
I don't care. I mean, just as long as people use it knowledgeably rather than as a propaganda tool. But they always use it as a propaganda tool, and they can rely generally upon the ignorance of the audience they address in doing so. I think that's fundamentally dishonest, to mislead people by propaganda words into thinking something which they wouldn't think if they knew better.
You said you don't care what other word is used to describe the action of prohibiting things. The word prohibition seems a reasonable one to use. Okay, unfortunately for you, the only example of prohibition was disastrous, so you don't want to use it because of all the films that have been made about it. Which word would you prefer if you had to choose?
I don't choose words that other people use. I choose my words. I believe in.
Well, use one then.
I believe in a free society where people choose their own words. But if
You've just objected to the use of the word prohibition.
If you want to use prohibition, then I will tell you that you're using dishonest propaganda because you're suggesting something in people's minds which is false. You're making a parallel which is simply false. And I challenge it every time it's used for that reason.
Yes, please, yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask Peter, is it just basically your argument is something is harmful, it should be illegal? Is that your basic argument?
No.
I mean, I can buy a hammer and bash my knee, and that's
it's more
harmful.
complicated than that. I mean, you have to be pragmatic about how you apply the law. So you couldn't.
So what other aspect apart from harm is your argument?
Well, practicality mainly. And it would be practical. It seems to me it would still be practical to prevent this country slipping into the third world by becoming one in which cannabis was generally used. I think it is possible.
I'm conscious that a lot of questions are coming to Peter, Howard. You're quite happy responding in the way you are?
Yeah, I'm quite happy,
Yes.
and I'm quite happy.
Could we have it was the gentleman with the stripy top on here, yeah?
You make a lot of distinction between things that, applying law in this free society, but you also say that something should be banned because of potential health effects. But the evidence for that is quite poor, quite sketchy.
Well, I can't help it being sketchy because of the nature of our knowledge of mental illness.
But then should we
But what I have to insist upon is that what happened, and again I beg you to read this book, what happened to Henry Coburn was, first of all, and I knew Henry before this happened, and I know him now. What happened to him was, first of all, disastrous. Secondly, irreversible. Thirdly, plainly material. But fourthly, hard to categorize and measure. And the other thing which Patrick will say to you if you speak to him about this, and I have talked to him about this a lot, is that when he wrote the book, he was astonished by how many of his contemporaries said to him, after he'd come out with this personal tragedy, something very similar has happened to me. Now, and he gets very angry, and this is a man, by the way, whose political opinions are almost anything totally the opposite of mine. He gets very angry every time anybody describes this as anecdotal. He says, how many anecdotes does it take before you realize that something serious is happening? I would welcome a serious, well-funded attempt to research this. I see the difficulties in it because of the difficulty in categorization. What we do know, and I rely heavily particularly on Professor Sir Robin Murray, who works at the Maudsley Hospital and is one of the most noted psychiatric practitioners in this country, who is extremely concerned about what he views as this correlation in a part of the country where cannabis use has been historically very heavy, and who says that quite a lot of people whom he sees, he says to them, do you take drugs? And they say, no, we don't take any drugs. And he says, what about cannabis? They say, oh, cannabis, yeah, we take that all the time, that's not a drug. The propaganda campaign for this drug, that it is soft and safe and harmless and one which ought to be decriminalized, has been so fantastically successful that these children, and they are children, 12, 13, 14-year-olds are taking it now, believe that it is not a drug. And in the midst of this stand these people saying, look, there's something wrong here. There are many, many pieces of research. I will be accused of cherry-picking if I say that these support my case. So, okay, they tend to support my case. I don't claim absolute knowledge. I think it's bad enough. I get letters from people. I had one the other day from someone whose husband had smoked cannabis without any incident at all for 20 years. And suddenly, with a very, very small warning, a certain amount of persecution complex beforehand, he became so unbalanced and unhinged that 12 police officers had to remove him from the family home to a mental hospital, where, as far as I know, he still is. These things happen to people. When they happen, the person to whom they happen is obviously devastated, but so are the people who love them. That person's wife, that person's children, or the parents of the person who undergoes these catastrophes, has their life changed forever? It's not a matter of, I can do what I like with my own body. Your own body is not entirely your own to play with. What happens to you affects other people unless you're wholly and utterly isolated from humankind. And I just think that looking at this, to say now is the time to make our laws even weaker than they already are, must be a response verging on the insane. It's the more this stuff is around, the more damage it does. This is the last moment to say, well, we know everything about it now, don't we? So let's get rid of the restrictions upon it.
Howard, what research would you draw upon to back up your case?
Well, I could just look at all the clever people who smoked dope. I mean, we've had sort of like a wealth of sort of glorious achievement in the arts as a result of it. We've had Nobel Prize winners. We've had Francis Crick, for example, who discovered or invented DNA, depending on one's view of the existence of theoretical entities, as a result of taking acid. We've got Richard Feynman, the most brilliant quantum electrodynamic person in the world, who's a heavy stoner. We've got Stephen Jay Gould, the paleontologist who smokes dope all the time. I mean, and yet we've got on Peter's side now...
He was dead.
What? But his last 20 years of his life, sorry.
Okay, but he's dead.
Well, he's probably still doing that. And we've got on Peter's side a reference to a book where someone has said, when I asked all these people, they all said the same thing. How many anecdotes do you need? A lot more.
Okay, I'd say one thing in response to that. Both Howard and I will be dead in 50 years. But I have absolutely no doubt that in 50 years, when this conversation is played back, he'll be the one who looks, how shall I say, complacent. And I'll be the one who looks prescient. And that's the difference. We have a problem here. It exists, and it is touching many people's lives very, very seriously. And I hear from them because of where I sit on my newspaper.
Yeah, I get letters from people in prison too, which you say doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't happen for possession, Howard. It happens for lots of
It does happen for possession.
It
does. It does. Twice or three times you possess, and the caution goes out of the window, the warning goes out of the window, and you're in the nick.
Tell you what, you send me any letters you get from anybody who's been locked up for cannabis possession, and I will look into the case because it's extraordinary.
Yeah, happy to
how
that,
these magistrates are ignoring what they're told to do, and how the sentencing guidelines are being ignored.
Okay, that's an action point, as they say.
You write to me with just one.
No, they could be, Peter. No, to be fair, they could be third or fourth offenders. Yeah, for sure. I'm not saying for the first time.
No, perhaps 40th offenders. Maybe.
Possibly 40th, but they end up in the nick for smoking dope, and that's wrong.
For smoking dope.
Okay, I'd like to get a couple
Maybe
more questions
one of the judges.
I've got the lady there. Sorry, I did miss you, but I will come to you next after that. Lady there, and you there. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and yeah, I've got you as well. Okay, yes.
Hi. Basically, I was just going to say that surely, in modern society, we're inadvertently ingesting so many harmful chemicals, anyways, that don't really carry that many benefits. And if we had the choice, we might not want to put inside our bodies, anyways. For example, MSG or petrol fumes, or just everyday examples. So I don't really know if making drugs legal would necessarily force people to take drugs, but more just open up the possibility that when people do make the choice to take drugs, they'd actually just be taking something that would be less harmful for them all around. And I just think that if drugs were, legalized and there was less if rather than just giving us neutral facts, we're always being told drugs are always being demonized, then we could just make an informed choice about whether you want to take a drug or not, like how people are given prescription drugs but can read the warning labels and know about the benefits but still make the choice ultimately. People know that paracetamol will screw up your liver if you take too much of it, for example.
Okay, thank you. We'll take that as a comment, actually. We'll come back to you next, yeah?
My question's for Howard. You mentioned earlier on that guns are bad.
Yeah.
And it is possible to legally own a gun in this country under certain circumstances,
yes, it is,
I believe.
Yeah.
But yet still people own guns illegally,
mm-hmm.
presumably because they can't get hold of the guns through legal channels. I just wondered if it's your belief that even if recreational drugs are legal, whether that will eliminate illegal drug use and illegal drug taking.
You mean would there be a black market even if they were legalised? Is that another way of asking that question?
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, no, I'm
and all
sure
of the gang things that you were describing,
black
whether the
markets will always
legalisation
exist,
would
yes.
get rid of any of that and therefore help
It would
the
reduce
situation.
it, and the government would have to supply reasonable quality dope. Otherwise, of course, there'll be a black market. So it won't eliminate it. No.
Hi, my question's for Howard. Isn't it selfish to legalise drugs when there is a high possibility that vulnerable people will be forced to take them by means of peer pressure, as is the case with alcohol and tobacco?
If there was a high possibility, yes. I don't think there is.
But there is, because it already happens with legal things like tobacco and alcohol. So surely it's going to follow that it will with drugs, as already happens in fact when it's illegal.
You think the incidence of consumption would increase if it's legalised?
Yeah, well, it'd be acceptable socially in a way that it kind of is now anyway, even though it's legal.
Well, I mean, mountain climbing is acceptable socially, and I certainly haven't been persuaded by any of my mountain climbing. I don't think so.
But young children, vulnerable teenagers, I think...
No, I think there should be age limits. I'm in favour of age limits, of course. I mean,
but how would you enforce that, realistically? If your parents
it's very
take
hard
drugs...
to enforce an age limit. We know people who drink underage, we know people who drive underage, but you don't see too many 3-year-olds driving around cars,
Drugs are more subtle, though. That's not the same as a car. That's...
No, we're talking about age limits.
Drugs if your parents take drugs, they'll be at home and you'll have ready access to them. So that's not the same as a kid.
Well, my father's car was in the garage. What are we talking about?
Do you have a point?
No, I think Howard's just dropped himself down a deep hole there. I'd leave him.
I think so.
Yep.
You hope.
Well, honestly, okay, how many people in this room would like to put their hands up and say they think drug use in this country will diminish if they are legalised? Thought so. Well, fantastic, thank you.
How many of you want drug use to minimise?
Proposition is ludicrous.
Gentleman there, please, yeah. We're running out of time now, so we'll have to be short, yeah.
Peter Howard, my question is to Peter about mental health problems. A lot of it is to do with the age of the teenager who's using cannabis and being able to get hold of cannabis on the street. And it's only down to the dealer on the street that they're being able to get hold of that. Surely if it was a regulated market, such as coffee shops as in Holland and other states in California and America, age would be limited and ID would be required to get into that establishment to be able to get hold of the cannabis.
Well, two simple points. One, as I said before, the drug itself is dangerous in any quantity to some people, and we don't know at what level, what strength, at what quantity the trigger might be thrown, which would render that person mentally ill for the rest of his life. Secondly, the existence of regulation and licensing doesn't guarantee that things don't reach the people that it's supposed to prevent. There is already in this country a substantial illegal alcohol market. It's very strong, particularly in East Anglia, where there are large numbers of immigrants from Eastern Europe who manufacture illicit vodka, but it's big, and it's growing, and it has all kinds of criminal activities attached to it. And also, I can take you to quite a lot of places in this country where I've visited, where you can find children way under the age of alcohol drinking large quantities of alcohol readily obtained, despite the fact that it's illegal for them to do so. I think this advancement of so-called regulation as an increased safeguard is I know some people buy it, but I think those who advance it are extremely irresponsible again, because what they're trying to suggest is, again, a form of legalization or decriminalization dressed up in a reassuring-sounding word won't mean what everybody who thinks about it seriously knows that it will mean. It means there will be more of these drugs about and more people will be exposed to them.
The evidence out in Holland and America is saying that even around the establishments where they can get cannabis from the dispensaries, there's no increase in teenage use, there's no increase in teenage misbehaviour, and it's the same in Holland. There's no increase. We've got the highest rate of teenage use in Europe.
Just in case you didn't hear it, sorry, Peter, because you didn't have the microphone.
Yeah. Sorry.
That there's no increase in teenage use from regulated markets in Holland, and that we have it here. Yeah.
Well, exactly as I said at the beginning. We have a far more extensive decriminalisation project than the Netherlands, which remains in many ways a rather conservative country in which there's a lot more objection to drug use by the population, and also I think probably more action against it by the police than there is here. We pretend to maintain laws against cannabis and don't. The Dutch are more honest about what they actually do. We are far more substantially and widely decriminalised than they are, and it's not at all surprising that we have higher use as a result.
Okay. No, I'm going to have to leave it there because we've got one more question and then I'll need to wind up. Sorry, yeah.
Hi, thanks. Peter indicated that, if I understood rightly, that he felt that the problem with drugs was dragging us down into a third world status. I think not. I think drugs, whatever you think about drugs, I think they're a useful vehicle for people like Peter and his class and the Daily Mail and so on to jump up and down and wave their arms around and point wildly in the wrong direction. If we're sort of like slipping into third world status, it's because of a series of incompetent governments who are in league with the kleptocrats and who are basically giving us levels of inequality unseen since about 1750. They've been demonising working class people, disabled people, single mothers, you name it, and stripping anything dignity, even money and dignity away from them. So don't be surprised if you see a massive increase in drug use because people basically have got lives which are not worth living.
We need to ask the question, please.
You need to look where the problem is.
Do you want? We'll treat that as a final comment. I want to ask you to wind up your arguments. Howard, I want you to go first in the key points you would make before we take the final vote.
Okay, well, it seems virtually certain that recreational drugs will continue to exist and that some people will continue to want to take them. There are quite simply just 4 ways of handling the situation and distributing the drugs. Each is familiar and well entrenched in society. They could be sold through high street outlets, such as supermarkets, as in the case of tobacco. They could be consumed in licensed premises, as in the case of alcohol. They could be obtained through medical prescription or over the pharmacy counter with professional controls. There's one more alternative: distribute recreational drugs through organised crime. Personally, I've had no problem with this last alternative. It enabled me to become very rich and have a wonderful life. But I do have a problem with a government that has opted to choose organised crime as the preferred means of drug distribution.
And Peter, you're going to stand.
Yeah. In a sense, all crime is caused by law. If we didn't have these tiresome laws against burglary, then burglary would be legal, and we would not have the problem, of course, of handing over the job of burglary to organised crime, because it wouldn't be criminal, so they wouldn't do it. This just simply dodges the question of whether you ought to have a law against the thing in the first place. We have laws against burglary because we hate it. We hate being burgled, and it ruins our lives when it happens to us, and we want people to be deterred from doing it. We have laws against drugs, in my view, because we want to protect particularly the young in our society from the immense pressure on them at the moment to take substances which can ruin their lives irreversibly, and in doing so ruin the lives of others. Now, a question for all of you here who think that it's a good idea for that to happen because maybe you yourselves or friends of yours have had pleasure out of taking drugs is this: do you really honestly believe that you can square with yourself the following proposition, that the proper price of your pleasure could be the ruin of somebody else's life? Do you really think that even in the most relaxed moral system it is possible to justify to yourself that high a price to be paid for what in the end is no more than a pleasure? If you do, then you can be in favour of the proposition. Otherwise, I think you really have to be against it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to take the vote again. The vote was on the possession and use of recreational drugs should be made legal. Who agrees with that proposition? Who disagrees with that proposition? And who doesn't know? I think there's been an increase in the don't knows and those who disagree with it, but marginally, and a slight decrease in those who are in favour of it, but only slightly. So I'm sorry we couldn't take any more questions, but if you'd like to ask our speakers more questions, they're going to be in the bookshop where you can get copies of their books if you'd like a copy of them. There are many more events in the Festival of Ideas. There's brochures outside, so please do come along to more. And please keep the debate going on our website and elsewhere. If you join with me in thanking Howard Marks and Peter Hitchens.